Hello, my name's James Cook. I'm a sociologist at the University of Maine at Augusta, and today I want to talk about queering gender and queering relationships. So when I use this word queer, I need to take a moment and talk about that word first, because the truth is that the word queer is itself, well, queer. Let's consider a number of the different definitions of the word queer and the lack of agreement about what the word queer means. Now, if you're of a certain age, my age or older, your understanding of the word queer may be as an insult used in a derogatory fashion, hurled against someone who is not straight in some way, who in their expression of either gender identity or sexuality does not fit the standard heterosexual mold of a man attracted to a woman or a woman attracted to a man. If you're also of my age and older, you may recall what happened in the late 1980s through the 1990s particularly, which was the seizing of this word queer from the derogatory sense by people who fit that mold, and using that word as a token of empowerment. I recall being outside Cincinnati, Ohio Art Museum, where the homoerotic photographs of Robert Mapplethorpe had been put on display and then banned and removed from display because at the time, in the early 1990s, it was considered obscene to have images of men loving men. And so there was a protest outside, and the people outside in that protest were chanting. They were chanting, "We're here, we're queer, we're proud of it, get used to it." And that seizing of the word queer is accepting the definition of queer as non-straight, and at the same time saying, yeah, we're not going to say that's derogatory anymore. We're going to celebrate what you derogate. What you insult, we will celebrate. So that is one of the other definitions of the word queer. Non-straight in a positive sense. That's a very general idea of queerness, though, and it fits many possibilities under an umbrella of not being straight. It's an umbrella that's gotten a little bit more crowded in recent decades. There used to be simply a consideration of gayness as a trait of men who were attracted to and engaged in sexual conduct with other men and romantic conduct with other men. That was then expanded to recognize that women exist in the world as well, and they were given a word, lesbian. Then, to some degree, still there is this effort to integrate people who are bisexual into the movement, who are sometimes attracted to people who are men and sometimes people who are women. Then there are others who say, well, wait, there's more than just men and women, and we can move across those boundaries in terms of gender identity. That's a T, LGBT. And then there's the I of intersex, people who, biologically speaking, have differences of sexual differentiation. A, people who are asexual, and some people have put on a plus. I've neglected the Q in the LGBTQIA plus ever-extending rainbow, as some people call it, which is queer. And for some definitions of queer, there's a an effort to redefine queerness going back to the original adjective sense of the word queer, which is that of strange, unusual, foreign, different. And the idea of those who take some of those who take the label queer and say, I am a queer person, means that they are someone who either transcends the biological expectation and the social expectations for the assignation of sex that they had at birth. Were they assigned male? Were they assigned female? And what are the social and sexual expectations of that? Or those who reject the idea of there simply being men and women in the first place. So you can say, I'm queer. Or, noun, I am a queer. As a verb, queer has entered the lexicon to mean, let's queer this idea, which means, if you think of the word query, right, Q-U-E-R-Y, not Q-U-E-R-R, it can take on similar meanings. It means to query previous definitions of a term, to unpack the implications of what those definitions mean for a model of the world and a model of people and a way that people interact, and then to upend that definition and think about ways it could be different. In other words, that idea of queer is to make what seems familiar, to make it strange. So people have talked about, let's queer heterosexuality. Let's take a look at the idea of heterosexuality and figure out what's unusual about the way that heterosexuality is defined in a particular culture that sits within a particular society. But queering is more than simply querying. It is more than questioning. For some people who use the word queer as a verb, to queer something is then not only to question something and not only to notice the ways in which something is strange, but it is to rewrite normative, that is, usual and accepted modes of being and interacting in the social world and belonging in the social world, to make things strange, to make things unusual and make them different in terms of individual identities, the roles that individuals identify with for their identities, which is the set of expectations for an identity, and then the scripts that people follow in their interactions as they perform their gender, as they perform their sexuality. Finally, in queering, one of the meanings of the word to queer is to break apart the idea of either and or. And this is a moment at which you can say there's a single queer movement, but a certain branch of queer intellectual thought breaks off and almost against this notion of LGB, right? Lesbian, gay, bisexual, because to be lesbian, you must clearly identify as a woman. To be gay, you must clearly identify as a man. To be bisexual, bi means that there is an existence of the masculine, that's over here, and it's one thing, and the feminine, and it's over here, and it's another thing, and there's a difference between the two. If you break apart a binary, what you do is you replace it with a notion that there are more than two things out there. There's more than one dimension along which two things exist, and that there are many possibilities along a line, a dimension, a plane of possibilities to move even beyond two dimensions, right? And in doing so, to queer is to break apart the idea of either or in the first place. And so it is to reject in some branches of queer theory, the idea of lesbianness, gayness, bisexualness, of masculinity, of femininity as the two and the only two things to which one would belong, even to blast apart the notions of distinct sexes, male and female. So, what does it mean to blast apart these binaries? What do we replace that with? One interesting model in thinking about gender and sexual identity is provided by the gender unicorn. And it is designed by Landon Pan and Anna Moore, and it's available at transstudent.org. So, as part of the trans student educational resources, one of the neat things about the gender unicorn is that it takes these words like man, woman, or male, female, or gay, straight, which are these binaries. You're one or the other, right? And it breaks those all-encompassing labels, like if you're a man, you must be strong, and you must not cry, and you must be attracted to women, which are this other thing, not like men, and you must do all these other things, wear certain clothes, not wear certain other clothes, have certain attitudes and beliefs. Same thing for women. The gender unicorn, as a graphic, as a guide to queering gender and sexuality, notes that there's actually just a set of dispositions, one might say orientations, to a variety of ways of being. One is in the notion of identity, and that one might identify as female, or one might identify as male, or one might identify as both, or one might identify as something entirely other. And it's possible to have those identifications at the same time, so that one might very strongly identify with the masculine, one might very strongly identify with the feminine, and one might strongly identify with a third or a fourth set of gender identity monikers that have their own expectations and values associated with them, and that those other gender identities are out there. Then the gender unicorn goes on and says, well, that may be your identity, that may be what you see yourself as being and how you manage the expectations others people have of you in the world. But then there's the expression of those, and that can be very different as well, and that one can be highly feminine in one's gender expression, highly masculine in one's gender expression, highly other in one's gender expression. For instance, camp. Is camp masculine? Is camp feminine? Or is camp as a set of gender identities something entirely different? And if you do camp, well, maybe you're doing a third gender. Maybe you've upended expectations in that way, at the same time being very feminine and very masculine. Or one could be neither very feminine, nor very masculine, nor very camp. And one might say to themselves then, I'm kind of agendered in my gender expression. Then you can think about the sex assigned at birth, and that could be, you could be assigned female, you could be assigned male, you could have been assigned a different medical category by medical professionals, or you could find out either as you grow up that you were nowhere specifically assigned, and that you continue to have an intersex role, or that you had an intersex condition that was quote unquote corrected, that you can go back and reclaim. So then there's the notion of physical attraction. That doesn't have to be the same as gender identity. It doesn't have to be the same as gender expression. It doesn't have to be related to sex at birth. You could be attracted to women, you could be attracted to men, you could be attracted to some other gender variable like campy people or non-campy people. And you could be attracted to all of those, or very much, or none of those at all. And then there's the idea of physical attraction being different from emotional attraction. So, who is it that you would like to have sexual relations with? Who is it that you would like to have a long talk with? And who would you like to express feelings of love for? They also don't have to be the same. And you don't have to limit yourself to just one category or the binary. That's what this gender unicorn points out. And we might think of other kinds of dimensions that perhaps in 10 years will recognize the gender unicorn has left out. Another way of thinking about moving beyond the gender binary is to go back a generation to this really famous image by Gayle Rubin of the charmed circle versus the outer limits. And so in the middle of this circle are charmed categories. And you'll notice for Gayle Rubin, when she says these are all sexual orientations, that we're used to saying sexual orientation means who are you attracted to? Are you attracted to those who have the same sex identification as you or an opposite sex identification as you? Okay, and so that the first move is that Gayle Rubin says actually there are many more sexual orientations. And she uses the words and the language of those who talk about those dimensions. For instance, right next to heterosexual and homosexual in Gayle Rubin's graphic is the label married versus in sin. Now, the phrase in sin represents a judgment, because in sin, to be engaged in sexual activity while not married, is to be in the outer limits. That area of social life in which you're doing something that is not approved. And so monogamous versus promiscuous, the word that is derogatory and negative in judgment, referring to people who have sexual relations with more than one person during a time period. Procreative versus non-procreative. Do you have sex in order to reproduce the species or for some other reason? Do you do it for free or for money? Do you do it at home, charmed, or do you do it in the park, outdoors? Derogated, made fun of, at best jokes, at worst arrested for. So that's an interesting thing that Rubin does in the 1980s, which is to reject. Notice all these areas of rejection, all these areas in which our society approves of some activity, and then along some dimension and an aspect of sexual orientation that is frowned upon. She wants us to notice this. But we could queer Gayle Rubin's charmed circle. We could say, is sexual orientation in the classic mode of heterosexual versus homosexual, are those the only possibilities? No, say queer theorists, it's not. For instance, what does someone who identifies themselves as cisgendered male and a cisgendered man, that is, someone who behaves and identifies as a man and was assigned as male at birth, what happens when they are attracted to someone who is not identifying as a woman, who might be trans and might not take on either of the monikers man or woman, but is transcending in that sense of trans identity, transcending gender and transcending the two sexes? What do we call that attraction? It doesn't fit. There are many other ways in which attraction may not fit to just a man, just a woman, even along that one dimension. Similarly, if we're talking about married versus in sin, that is ignoring the huge range of possibilities, like people who are married but don't have sex, or people who are divorced or separated and have sex, or people who are cohabiting and they are having sex with one another, but and they're not separated in their living facilities. So they have that one aspect that is somewhat marriage-like, but in other ways they're not like those who are married. But it's also not simply a case of there being just one lumped in other. There are many other possibilities. So to queer our identity is to recognize that there are multiple dimensions of possible variation along which we can identify, and they can be independent of one another, and they're not just either this or that, but have many other possibilities at multiple strengths, to recall the gender unicorn, and also that our relationships can take on the same quality, who we are and what we do with others. So then I would encourage you to think about, if we think about those roles and those identities, right, that describe what we ought to do or what we choose to do or what we feel comfortable doing. What is that role? Sometimes it's just important to name it. So if you had to name your gender, I encourage you to take out a sheet of paper. And I want you on that sheet of paper to write down right at the top. I want you to indicate what is your gender identity. Maybe you've never written this down before. Maybe you've thought it's obvious. Well, then state it obviously. Maybe you think it's not obvious. Maybe this is hard for you, in which case, good, think about it for a good long time. Write down that term, okay? Now that is simply to use what queer theorists borrow from sociology, particularly Irving Goffman and his notion of dramaturgy, the idea that society is like a theater. If this is a role, well, then there are certain behaviors that role carries out, just like there are characters in a play, and those characters or roles that you would try out for if you were an actor would have to be ready to carry out, right? Is your role one of extroversion or introversion? Is your role one of being physically large, physically small, making oneself in one's expression physically large or physically contained? Oh, so many different possibilities. What are the general orientations that you have in sexuality, in gender, in occupation? If we move beyond the charmed circle versus outer limits for sexuality and imagine one in general for gender roles, in one's orientation toward children, in one's orientation toward cleaning and cooking and educational choices in classes and so on. So many possibilities, so many ways to describe a role richly, and I want you to do that now. Pause this video and write down your role expectations. If you were describing it as part of a play, what would that be? So pause this video and try it. Okay. Now, I want you to think about something else, which is that very few plays are monologues. That is, it's not just one person standing on a stage, right? So if we take Irving Goffman's dramaturgical theory, that our social life is played out on a stage, and we practice our lines and we're trying to pull off a scene, then you can imagine different scenes involving not just single actors, single role players, but individuals taking on performances in relation to others. Marital partner, friend, co-worker, parent, child, so many different ones of these. Each of these scenes has a script. For instance, we might think of a script which is getting ready for dinner. How would that scene be played off? And what is the expectation for your gender role as you've just defined it, right? In that scene. What are the other roles that are there in the scene, right? And what do they do? How do they respond? How do you interact to successfully pull off that scene? So take a sheet of paper, write down the name of one kind of typical social scene that has to be carried off. And maybe it's asking for a raise, maybe it's making dinner, maybe it's getting the kids off to school, maybe it's making love, maybe it's hitting on, that is, making clear one's attraction to the other. Who are the role players in the dominant social script? What roles do they play? Are they expected to play in the dominant social script? Well, then I want you to rewrite both of those things. You have a gender role that you have the expectations for, and you have a scene. Ask yourself, is that gender role all that you want to be? Can you, on the other hand, say that it's not all you want to be? It's not all that you want to do. If you could redefine your role, your social role, what would the title of that gender be? And how would it act? And then you've got a scene that you've just described in terms of expectations for how it's carried out, right? But is that the scene that is ideal? Is there something wrong with that scene? Is the script as you've written it a script that you want to follow, that you want to see others follow? If so, why and in what ways, for what reasons? If not, take out another sheet of paper and rewrite that role. Maybe you need to write up some new characters, some new roles. Maybe they need different names. Maybe it's the same characters and the same roles, and they're just interacting in different ways, leading to different outcomes, leading to different conversations, confrontations, interactions. Remember, as you're writing a script, that you're not just writing words that are said, but you can also, in brackets, describe actions that are carried out. Rewrite that script. You have the ability to do that. And in doing that, you have the ability to create a new model. Just like people in the lesbian, gay, bisexual, also queer movement have done across time, and offered new possibilities to people. Perhaps the most radical of which is to say, you don't have to limit yourself to the model that we propose either. You can be something else. And in interactions with others, in scenes with others, you can do something else. Write it down. Take a look at it. Take a look at what you do, what you are expected to do, and what you would like to do, who you would like to be. Then ask yourself, what kind of changes would you need to move from the actual world you're in to the ideal world that you just wrote down on a sheet of paper?